On the frozen morning of January 1st, 1855, the people of Callaway County, Missouri, woke to the bitter scent of smoke and something far more disturbing drifting across their farmland. In the ruins of the Newsome barn, they uncovered a scene that would become one of the most chilling and deliberately hidden chapters in American legal history. Within the charred remains lay what was left of Robert Newsome, a well-regarded landowner. His body was burned so completely that only his gold pocket watch and wedding ring survived to confirm his identity. This was no accident and no random act of violence. It was the end of 5 years of relentless abuse that drove a 19-year-old enslaved woman named Celia to commit an act so shocking the Missouri courts would spend months debating whether she had any legal right to protect herself. What happened in that barn was not just murder. It was a confrontation with the deepest contradictions of American society. A truth so unsettling that local authorities tried to erase every record they could. The story of Celia has survived only through fragments, court transcripts, newspaper accounts, and testimonies preserved in the Missouri State Archives, though many suspect that key documents were quietly destroyed in the decades that followed. In 1850, Callaway County was a thriving farming region along the Missouri River, where tobacco and hemp fields stretched across rolling hills and southern plantation culture held strong. Nearly 40% of the population lived in bondage, laboring in fields and homes for families who had come from Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, seeking wealth built on enslaved labor. Robert Newsome was a man who prospered in this system. At 60 years old, he managed a farm 6 miles south of Fulton with a white 2-story farmhouse, several outbuildings, and 60 acres of fertile land. Widowed since 1849, he raised his daughters Virginia and Mary while relying on the forced labor of 5 enslaved people. Though not wealthy by plantation standards, Newsome was known for his strict control. Neighbors described his farm as operating with military precision, where the enslaved worked with the fearful efficiency of those who knew the punishment for failure. In church, he appeared pious, a regular at Methodist services, and a generous donor to missionary causes, though his household rarely accompanied him. Outwardly respectable, inwardly ruthless, Newsome embodied the contradictions of Little Dixie, where faith, power, and brutality coexisted in uneasy silence. In June 1850, Robert Newsome made the purchase that would determine not only his fate, but also that of a 14-year-old girl whose name would haunt Missouri's courts for decades. At the Audrain County Courthouse, he laid down $800 in gold for Celia, described coldly in the bill of sale as a Negro girl of good health and breeding potential. The seller, William Grayson, had owned her since birth, but mounting debts forced him to sell. Grayson made it clear that Celia was fit for housework, and more disturbingly, for breeding a word heavy with unspoken horrors in the slave markets of the antebellum South. Her journey from Grayson's farm to Newsome's was less than 50 miles, but it carried her into 5 years of unrelenting torment. Celia was striking for her age, tall with intelligent eyes and a reserved manner that hinted at education beyond what the law allowed. Those who later testified said she could read simple words and do basic arithmetic, rare skills for someone in her position and forbidden under Missouri's slave codes. The Newsome farm she entered that summer was a world designed for control. The main house stood on a rise, watching over a single log slave cabin with no windows and a dirt floor. Behind it loomed the barn, a stout timber structure with walls that muffled sound, a place that would one day become infamous. From the start, the atmosphere felt different. Neighbors recalled sensing unease among Newsome's enslaved workers, Ben, a man in his 30s, Coffee, a middle-aged woman, her teenage daughter Patsy, and young Joe, barely 10. Years later, they admitted Newsome had warned them not to interfere in his dealings with Celia. Whatever suspicions they had, no one could have foreseen that this quiet girl would one day ignite a legal firestorm that forced Missouri to face questions it had long evaded. Could an enslaved woman defend herself against sexual assault? Could property resist its master? And what happened when the law's protection of white male power clashed with its claim to Christian morality? The nightmare began her very first night. Celia's own testimony, later read aloud in court, described it in words so searing that the court reporter's handwriting visibly faltered as he recorded them. He told me I was to come to the house when he called, she whispered. Said I was bought for more than field work and that I'd learn what that meant soon enough. From that moment forward, the pattern was relentless. By day, Robert Newsom posed as the respectable Christian farmer, working his fields, attending church, shaking hands in town. By night, behind closed doors, he revealed the truth of his purchase. At night, after his daughters had gone to bed, and the other enslaved workers were ordered to stay in their quarters, Robert Newsom would summon Celia to the main house. Over the months and years, the physical evidence of these assaults became undeniable. In 1852, at just 16, Celia gave birth to her first child, a boy who carried Newsom's unmistakable features from his pale green eyes to the shape of his jaw. Though his daughters Virginia and Mary later claimed ignorance of their father's nightly abuses, neighbors testified it would have been impossible not to notice a pregnancy under their own roof. What made Celia's situation even more unbearable was the way Newsom ensured silence. He kept a leather-bound ledger recording every supposed infraction among the enslaved, real or imagined. This book was less a record than a weapon, a constant reminder that any attempt to help Celia could bring swift punishment. Ben, the eldest enslaved man on the farm, later testified that Newsom warned him directly. What happens in this house after dark is nobody's business but mine. Anyone who makes it their business will find themselves sold downriver. In Missouri, that phrase carried a special terror. To be sold downriver meant being shipped to the brutal sugar and cotton fields of Louisiana and Mississippi, where survival was measured in years, not decades. The isolation of Newsom's farm made his crimes easier to conceal. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, too far to hear anything. Oak trees shielded the slave quarters from the road, and the main house was positioned so Newsom could see anyone approaching long before they reached his door. Within this private fortress, Celia bore a second child in 1853, this time a daughter also bearing her master's features. Reverend John Hammond, the local Methodist minister, would later remark on Newsom's peculiar satisfaction during these years, noting how he never sought to remarry as one might expect of a widower, but seemed perfectly content with his household situation. Missouri law gave Celia no escape. Enslaved people were property unable to file complaints or seek protection. Even worse, the law explicitly ruled out the idea that a white man could rape an enslaved woman. Property could not withhold consent from its owner. This legal void allowed Newsom to act with impunity, even flaunting his control. Witnesses recalled him parading Celia into town, buying her dresses far too fine for a slave, along with ribbons and soaps more suited to a mistress than a servant. The toll on Celia was visible. Coffee, another enslaved woman working in the household, testified that Celia often appeared withdrawn and fearful, especially when the daughters were away. The house felt like death itself had settled over it, Coffee recalled. Yet perhaps most unsettling was Newsom's conviction that his actions were not only legal, but righteous. He reportedly boasted that he cared better for his property than other masters, twisting his assaults into a perverse form of benevolence. But by late 1854, something shifted. Witnesses said Celia grew bolder, asking questions that no enslaved person was supposed to ask. She spoke more openly to the others, once asking whether someone had the right to defend themselves if the law offered no protection. By then she was pregnant again, her third child, and something inside her had reached its breaking point. That winter, Callaway County endured bitter cold, with snow so heavy that farms lay cut off from one another for weeks. The weather provided a perfect cover for what would soon happen. As New Year's night approached, Celia's demeanor had changed. No longer only fearful, she carried herself with a quiet resolve. Soon the years of abuse would culminate in an act that turned victim into avenger and shook Missouri to its core. Ben would later testify that Celia had begun asking unsettling questions: how fast fire consumed different materials, whether heat alone could bring down a building, and what became of bones in flames. At the time, he assumed her curiosity came from tending household fires during the bitter winter. But there was more beneath the surface. Coffee recalled seeing Celia quietly gather scraps of rope, bits of metal-dried hay, and pine pitch. When asked, Celia claimed she was preparing for emergencies in case heavy snow left the family trapped without supplies. Given the severity of the season, no one pressed further. Only later in the courtroom would the truth emerge. She had been planning something far more deliberate. Court records suggest Celia had somehow gained access to legal texts, possibly from Newsom's own library, and through them, she came to understand her grim reality. Missouri law offered her nothing. An enslaved woman could not accuse a white man of rape. The courts recognized no such crime. If the law would not protect her, she would have to create her own justice. The turning point came in late December. Newsom announced that his daughters would spend New Year's week with relatives in Jefferson City, leaving him alone on the farm. For Celia, heavily pregnant with her third child, this was no reprieve. She knew from experience that when the daughters were away, the abuse only grew worse. On December 30th, she made her first open act of defiance. According to her testimony, she confronted Newsom directly in the kitchen with coffee nearby. She pleaded with him to end his nightly assaults, citing her pregnancy and her failing health. It was a shocking breach of the unspoken rules of the farm. Newsom's response was immediate and merciless. Coffee heard raised voices, then the sound of a struggle. Entering the room, she found Celia on the floor, lips split and bleeding, with Newsom looming over her. "You don't make demands in my house," he snarled. "You'll do as you're told when you're told, or you'll learn what real punishment looks like." That night, as the temperature dropped below zero, he proved his point. Celia later testified that he summoned her to his room with more violence than ever before, making it clear that even her pregnancy offered no protection. The assault that followed was the most brutal she had endured in 5 years of torment. But Celia was no longer the same terrified girl who had entered his farm. Months of quiet planning had hardened into resolve. She had studied fire, gathered tools, and weighed her options. On December 31st, 1854, as Robert Newsom prepared for another night of unchecked power, Celia prepared for something else entirely. An act of resistance that would shake Missouri's courts, challenge the foundations of its laws, and transform her from victim into one of the most defiant figures in American legal history. New Year's Eve of 1854 descended on the Newsom farm with a punishing wind that screamed through the skeletal trees and pressed down on the frozen land like a suffocating weight. The temperature had plunged to nearly 20 degrees below zero. Frost sealed the windows of the farmhouse, turning the outside world into a blur of white silence. For Celia, who had spent weeks preparing for this night, the brutal cold was not just weather, it was cover. Through the day, Robert Newsom carried on his routine, feeding livestock, checking his tobacco stores. But his temper ran hot beneath the icy air. Ben later recalled that his master had been drinking steadily, not enough to dull him, but enough to make him more volatile than usual. Coffee noticed his restlessness, the way he paced to the road, peering into the snow as though hoping his daughters might return early. But the storm had locked the roads in place. Newsom was alone with his household. His attention circled back again and again to Celia. What he failed to see were her careful preparations. Coffee would later remember how Celia shifted firewood at the hearth, adjusted the oil lamps just so, and made quiet trips to the barn under the pretense of tending animals. Every move was subtle, ordinary enough not to draw suspicion. Yet taken together, they were signs of intent. At 8 o'clock, Newsom dismissed the others to their quarters, as he had done countless nights before. Ben, Coffee, Patsy, and Little Joe retreated to their cabin, gathering by their weak fire, forced into silence by years of fear. The thick log walls and the storm outside had always muffled the crimes in the big house. But tonight, the pattern shifted. Coffee later testified that what she heard was different. No muffled rhythm of routine abuse, but stretches of silence, broken by sharp, irregular sounds, furniture scraping something heavy, crashing the sharp shatter of crockery. Then around 10, Newsom's voice rang out, not in fury, but in surprise. Coffee froze. She had never heard that tone from him before. And then silence again. Long silence. So long it became unbearable. What happened in that bedroom would only come to light months later when Celia stood in court, her voice clear as she described the moment she had been pushed too far. Newsom had summoned her, as always, and as always she resisted in silence until that night. I told him I could not bear it anymore, she testified. I said the baby I carried might not survive if he forced himself again. I begged him, in the name of Christian mercy, to wait until the child was born. His response was not mercy. It was violence. He struck her hard enough to send her sprawling to the floor. But when she rose, it was not in submission. For the first time in 5 years, Robert Newsom faced something he never expected from Celia. Not obedience, not silence, resistance. Celia's testimony revealed the moment the cycle of terror finally broke. I looked him in the eye, she told the court, and said that if he touched me again, I would defend myself. I said I didn't care what the law allowed him to do. There had to be some limit to what one human being could endure from another. Her words, shocking enough on their own, were followed by the act that would stand at the center of one of Missouri's most infamous trials. Robert Newsom reacted to her defiance with fury. He lunged his hands, clamping around her throat, his voice hissing that she would submit or he would kill her, blaming her death on complications of pregnancy. But Celia had anticipated this moment. For weeks, she had prepared, keeping a heavy iron poker hidden near the bedroom fireplace within reach should desperation demand it. As her breath failed and her vision blurred, her fingers closed around the iron. Summoning the last of her strength, she swung it hard against his temple. The sound of his body hitting the floor, she later said, was unlike anything she had ever heard, a sickening thud that combined the weight of his fall with the sudden silence that followed the absence of the breathing and threats that had haunted her nights for 5 long years. For several tense minutes, she stood frozen, waiting to see if he would stir, if the nightmare would resume. But it did not. Newsom's skull was fractured, his eyes glassy and fixed. The master was dead. With his death, Celia faced a new terror. She had killed a white man in Missouri. Slave or free woman or man, it didn't matter. The law was clear, killing a master meant death. Self-defense had no meaning when the law itself denied her humanity. Panic might have been natural flight, almost instinctive. But Celia did neither. Instead, she began executing a plan that spoke to the desperate ingenuity forged from years of survival. She was 6 months pregnant, battered from the struggle, and alone in the frozen night. Yet every move she made bore the mark of grim preparation. She had thought of this moment, rehearsed it in her mind. And now she acted with a precision that seemed almost impossible. The first challenge was the body. Robert Newsom was heavy far beyond what her condition should have allowed her to move. But Celia had prepared. She had laid out ropes and Sheets' tools hidden in plain sight. With them, she managed to bind his body and drag it down the stairs out of the farmhouse and into the barn. That barn was no ordinary outbuilding that night. It had been arranged for this purpose. During her afternoon chores, she had shifted hay into place-stacked firewood in careful order and collected combustibles, pine pitch dried corn stalks, even scraps of fine cloth Newsom had once purchased to dress her like something more than a slave. Now, those same gifts became fuel for his destruction. Celia had built a pyre, and as the wind howled outside and the world froze in silence, she prepared to erase her master's body from existence. The fire Celia set that night was no accident and no ordinary blaze. Coffee testified that sometime after midnight, she saw a strange flickering light from the barn, far brighter than a lantern should be. By 2 a.m, a smell drifted across the frozen fields, acrid and nauseating. It was like when we butchered hogs in the fall, Coffee recalled, but sweeter and more sickening. Inside the barn, Celia had built a pyre calculated to burn hot and fast, destroying what needed to vanish, while leaving the building itself intact enough to suggest an accident. She layered hay pine pitch corn stalks and even scraps of fine cloth materials that ignited quickly and burned fiercely while the barn's thick timbers held. By dawn on January 1st, 1855, the fire had burned itself out. To a casual observer, it looked like misfortune, perhaps a stray spark or a carelessly placed lantern. But Celia's work was far too deliberate for chance. When the others emerged from their cabin that morning, they found Celia in the kitchen, calmly preparing breakfast, as though nothing had happened. When Ben asked about their master, she answered evenly. Robert Newsom had gone to town on business. In the frigid holiday weather, the explanation strained belief, but it held for a few hours. Suspicion began with the arrival of Thomas Schultman, a neighbor expecting to discuss land. Finding only Celia at the house and noticing Newsom's heavy winter coat still hanging on its hook, Schultman's doubts deepened. His questions pressed harder, and Ben Cornard admitted he had not actually seen Newsom leave. Worse still, Newsom's horse remained in its stall. As neighbors gathered, drawn by whispers of the fire, and their missing friend Celia's story unraveled. Schultman and 2 others searched the barn more thoroughly. What they found shattered any illusion of an accident, bone fragments, teeth, and Newsom's gold pocket watch, its case blackened, but still etched with the initials RN. Word spread, and by the next day, the farm was swarming with men determined to uncover the truth. On the afternoon of January 2nd, 1855, the confrontation came. Celia was brought to the barn, where the charred evidence lay. Farmers and businessmen, pillars of Callaway County, stood in grim silence as Schultman held up the ruined watch. They expected a collapse hysterics denial. Instead, Celia met their eyes with what one witness called an unsettling calm. She had not endured 5 years of terror to cower now. Yes, she said firmly. I killed Robert Newsom. Her voice did not waver. I killed him because he had been raping me for 5 years since I was 14. I killed him because he told me he would never stop, that he would keep on until I died, and that my children would suffer the same fate. I killed him because the law gave me no other choice. The barn fell silent. It was more than a confession. It was an accusation spoken by a woman whom the law called property, but who now demanded to be heard as a human being. By naming her master's abuse as rape, Celia had broken one of Missouri's most rigid taboos. She had claimed a right the law itself denied her the right to refuse. Schultman later admitted that his first instinct was to strike her for such insolence. But something in her composure stopped him. She was not pleading, not broken. She was telling the truth and daring them to face it. This was not the collapse of a terrified girl. It was the calm resolve of someone who had made a calculated decision and was ready to face the consequences. She looked at us like we were the criminals. Thomas Schultman later testified like she was the judge and we were the ones on trial. Celia's account of Robert Newsom's crimes cut like a knife. She did not speak vaguely or emotionally. She laid out specifics, the years of systematic rape, the 2 children born of abuse, the ledger of threats and punishments that kept the rest of the enslaved silent, the chilling promise that her daughter would one day endure the same fate. But Celia went further. She described the murder itself with clinical clarity, how she had studied Newsom's routines, chosen her moment, hidden the poker, and built the pyre. She spoke of temperature of materials that burned hot and fast, of arranging the barn so the fire would appear accidental. "I spent every night for 4 months planning how to kill him," she told the stunned men. "I studied his books to learn about law, about fire, about what it would take to make him disappear completely. I wanted him to burn the way he made me burn inside." The horror deepened when she turned her words toward law itself. From scraps of legal text, Celia had constructed a philosophy dangerous enough to shake Missouri's slave order at its core. "If I am property," she said, "then I cannot be guilty of crimes against my owner because property cannot commit crimes. But if you say I am guilty of murder, then I must be a person with the right to defend myself. You cannot have it both ways." The men who listened were shaken. Some called for her immediate hanging to prevent her arguments from echoing in a courtroom. Violence was familiar. Reason was far more dangerous. And then came her most explosive revelation. Celia named names. She spoke of free black allies in Jefferson City who had smuggled her documents, of a sympathetic courthouse clerk who let her study law books, and most damning of white citizens who had looked away. Judge Marshall, she claimed, had seen bruises on her arms when she was paraded into town. Reverend Hammond had seen her children and recognized their father. Dr. Breenridge had treated her broken ribs. They all knew, she declared, and they all decided that Robert Newsom's reputation mattered more than my suffering. The decision to pursue a formal trial instead of a lynching came down to Judge William Hall, a Virginia-born jurist with deep ties to Missouri's slaveholding elite. Hall understood the danger. If the community ignored Celia's words, her story would spread like wildfire anyway. Better to contain the crisis inside a courtroom where the law could attempt to control the narrative. Yet even as preparations began, investigators discovered evidence that complicated everything. Hidden in Celia's quarters were books, newspapers, and legal documents no enslaved woman should have possessed. Worse still, they found journals in her hand, meticulous damning recording not only her own abuse, but also the exploitation of other enslaved women across Callaway County. This was no longer just a murder case. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The discovery of Celia's journals sent shockwaves through Callaway County. Neatly written in her own hand, they recorded names, dates, and specific incidents that revealed sexual violence as a systemic practice, not an isolated horror confined to one farm. Prominent families, the very pillars of the community, were implicated. For decades, the region's leadership had worked to maintain silence. But Celia's writings threatened to drag those secrets into daylight. The question of how a young, enslaved woman had acquired the literacy, legal knowledge, and intellectual framework to produce such a record sparked suspicion almost as dangerous as the murder itself. Who had been teaching her? How far did this clandestine network extend? And what other enslaved women might already be learning to resist in similar ways? When Celia was taken to the Callaway County Jail, she carried with her not just the weight of a killing, but the possibility of unraveling the legal, moral, and social order of Missouri itself. By the time her trial opened on October 9th, 1855, the case had become a spectacle. The courthouse was packed with spectators from across the state, the press fanning flames on both sides. Abolitionist papers hailed her as a symbol of righteous defiance, while pro-slavery publications denounced her defense as a threat to the very foundation of the slave system. Judge William Hall himself, a product of Virginia's planter aristocracy, presided over questions the Missouri courts had never dared confront. Could an enslaved person claim self-defense against a master? Did laws protecting women from sexual assault apply universally or only to white women? And most damning of all, could property be held criminally responsible for resisting its owner? Celia's defense team, led by John Jameson, a seasoned attorney who took her case pro bono, despite enormous pressure, built their strategy on Missouri's existing statutes protecting women from rape. The law made no racial distinction, Jameson argued, and thus should apply to all women within the state. By that logic, Celia's killing of Newsom was not murder, but justifiable homicide, a desperate act of resistance against unlawful assault. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Pruitt, framed their argument around Missouri's slave code. Enslaved people were property. As such, they could not legally withdraw consent from their owners. If the court accepted Celia's defense, Pruitt warned it would set a precedent that could unravel slavery itself, making every master vulnerable to lethal resistance. The trial testimony forced white Missourians to confront realities they had long chosen to ignore. Coffee Ben and other enslaved witnesses described in harrowing detail the years of systematic abuse. Celia endured testimony so raw that even pro-slavery observers squirmed. They revealed the hidden network that had supported her enslaved people, free blacks and sympathetic whites, who had smuggled her books and legal documents, connecting her indirectly to the Underground Railroad. Unlike others who sought freedom in the North, Celia had stayed. She knew escape could never liberate her children. Her only path to protect them was through defiance. The most devastating blow to the prosecution came from Dr. Marcus Breenridge, the local physician. Summoned under oath, he admitted that he had treated Celia for injuries consistent with rape and beatings on multiple occasions. His medical records entered into evidence documented trauma dating back to when Celia was only 15. With each line of his testimony, the courtroom grew heavier, the reality of her suffering harder to deny. What unfolded was more than a murder trial. It was a public reckoning with slavery's most intimate cruelties and a test of whether Missouri's courts would acknowledge the humanity of an enslaved woman who had dared to defend herself. Dr. Marcus Breenridge's testimony shook the room. "I knew what I was seeing," he admitted, his voice nearly lost in the silence of the packed courtroom. "But I also knew that speaking out would accomplish nothing except destroying my practice and endangering my family. The law provided no mechanism for protecting an enslaved woman from her master's abuse." His words underscored the grim truth everyone had known, but no one had dared to act. Even more explosive was the testimony of Margaret Foster, a free black seamstress from Fulton, who had quietly maintained contact with Celia throughout her ordeal. Foster revealed that she had spent nearly a decade documenting cases of sexual abuse against enslaved women, keeping meticulous records that implicated dozens of prominent families across central Missouri. Celia wasn't unique, she declared. She was just the first one brave enough to fight back. "Every enslaved woman I knew lived with this terror. Every one of them knew their bodies belonged to their masters in ways that went far beyond labor." The defense then introduced evidence, even more damning letters among Newsom's personal papers, describing an informal network of slaveholders who shared enslaved women for sexual purposes, arranging to borrow them while wives were away visiting relatives. The exposure of these private agreements sent ripples of unease through the courtroom, for the names mentioned belonged to some of Missouri's most powerful men. Desperate, the prosecution pivoted. They claimed Celia had acted out of jealousy, not self-defense, framing her as a spurned mistress rather than a brutalized victim. But this strategy backfired spectacularly. By acknowledging a sexual relationship at all, the state undermined its central argument that an enslaved woman could not by law be raped. The contradiction was glaring, and the courtroom murmured with the realization. The trial had burst beyond Callaway County. Reporters from New York, Boston, Charleston, and beyond filled the press benches, their dispatches spreading Celia's story across the nation. Northern abolitionists hailed her as a symbol of resistance and organized rallies demanding her release. Southern politicians raged that the trial itself was a subversive attack on the institution of slavery. Missouri had become the stage for a national reckoning. When the jury retired, the air in Fulton was electric. Their deliberations stretched to 3 days, an extraordinary length in a capital case reflecting the moral and legal knots they could not untangle. On October 19, 1855, the jury foreman Thomas Westbrook, a farmer and Methodist lay preacher, stood to deliver the verdict. His voice wavered. "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree," he said. Then, almost trembling, he added, "But we recommend mercy based on the extraordinary circumstances of this case." Legally, the guilty verdict had been unavoidable under Missouri law. Yet the recommendation for mercy was unprecedented. In their written statement, the jurors confessed that they had convicted Celia only because the law compelled them to do so. In conscience, they believed her actions morally justified. They urged the governor to commute her sentence and pressed the state legislature to address the contradictions in the law that had forced their hand. Judge William Hall, when pronouncing sentence, delivered what historians still regard as one of the most extraordinary judicial statements in American legal history. From the bench, he acknowledged that the trial had laid bare questions of law and conscience, which this court is not equipped to reconcile. He told the courtroom that Celia's case exposed a rift in the very foundations of Missouri society, one that lawmakers, and perhaps God alone, would have to judge. Judge William Hall pronounced the only sentence the law allowed: death. Yet in doing so, he condemned the very system that bound his hands. This court has been compelled to apply laws that reduce human beings to property, while simultaneously holding them accountable as persons when they resist their dehumanization, he declared. This contradiction lies at the heart of our legal system, and will, I predict, ultimately destroy the institution of slavery itself. Celia killed her master, and under our laws, she must die for that crime. But history will judge that the greater crime was the system that gave her no other choice. Celia's execution was scheduled for December 21, 1855, but she never stood on the gallows. On November 23, with the aid of accomplices never identified, she escaped from the Callaway County Jail. Despite frantic searches and the lure of a generous reward, she was never recaptured. Rumors spread like wildfire that she had been carried north by Underground Railroad operatives, that she had drowned trying to cross the Missouri River, that she lived out her days under another name in freedom. Her fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of American history. What is certain is that her case reverberated far beyond Callaway County. Abolitionists seized on the trial transcripts, printing and distributing them widely. Celia became a symbol of resistance, her name invoked at rallies and in newspapers from New England to Ohio. For enslaved people across the South, her defiance stood as proof that even within bondage, resistance was possible. The consequences rippled outward. Families implicated by Margaret Foster's testimony faced social ruin and economic boycott, some forced to leave Missouri altogether. Dr. Marcus Breenridge's practice collapsed after his testimony. Yet he embraced his role, joining abolitionist circles and later helping establish medical schools that trained physicians to serve freed people after emancipation. Most importantly, the legal arguments forged in Celia's defense, the contradictions of treating enslaved people as property while holding them responsible as persons echoed in abolitionist literature and constitutional debates. Those ideas became weapons in the national struggle that would soon ignite into civil war. The Newsom farm itself became a scar on the land. No buyer would touch it. The barn was left in ruins, its blackened timbers collapsing into the earth. Locals whispered that the site was haunted, that cries could be heard on winter nights when the wind cut through the trees. By 1860, the farm had been swallowed by wilderness, leaving only the crumbling stone foundation of the main house, a silent marker of where one woman's desperate act forced a nation to confront its darkest contradictions. Celia's story reminds us that, even in the most oppressive systems, human dignity asserts itself, often at unimaginable cost. Her courage exposed truths the law sought to deny, truths that still echo in the questions we ask about justice today. Do you believe Celia's actions were justified given the world she faced? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if this story has moved you, subscribe to our channel, hit the bell, so you never miss the hidden chapters of history, and share this video with someone who understands that the past is never truly past. I'll see you in the next story, another tale they tried to bury, but will bring back to light.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.